Welcome to the Friends of Fantasy Benefits Baseball Podcast. I am Justin Mason, lead fantasy writer and analyst at friendsoffantasybenefits.com. Joining me on this episode is Dave McDonald. How you doing, my friend?
Good, buddy. Long time no see.
I'm kind of sick of you at this point.
I know. It feels like we've been together for hours.
We quite literally have been, and it's late. It's late for me. Well, it's not really late for me, but it's definitely late for you. We're rolling up on 3:00 in the morning your time.
We are, yeah.
So I appreciate you being able to start a bit later tonight and
all good
record for a really long time. So obviously everybody has gotten these episodes in increments. Hopefully people are enjoying them. Again, I want to remind everybody. If you have ideas for our new segments and kind of how we're running things now here at Friends of Fantasy Benefits, definitely let us know. You can reach Dave on Twitter at RunDMCD. You can reach me on Twitter at Justin Mason, FWFB, Fantasy Benefit, or Friends of Fantasy Benefits at Fantasy Benefits. If you have ideas, if you have things you want us to talk about that we're not talking about, or other people, more importantly, really, other people aren't talking about in the industry, let us know, because we're always willing to kind of craft things to make them more listenable and more applicable for your particular league. So, but today what we're going to do is a strategy kind of section, and we're going to focus on NFBC leagues. Now, there will be certain things on this that don't apply to a generic Yahoo or ESPN or CBS league or Fantrax, because we are focused on the NFBC, but there are other parts that I think are very applicable. And when you're playing NFBC, you're playing with the best of the best. And I don't think anybody questions that. While there are good players that play everywhere, the best overall talent, I think, is still in the NFBC. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. Maybe next week's strategy section will be on something completely different. But today's strategy section is on this. So let's talk about it. We're 2 months into the season. How are you changing your approach at this point in the season?
Well, so when I get into May is usually when I start looking at the standings and looking at what I'm deficient in, because you don't want to overcorrect necessarily anything in the first month, because you're kind of still trying to figure out who guys are, right? Like as you get into May, you can't get two months behind, so you got to start making some sort of corrections. If you're way behind in steals, okay, who can I pick up to help me there or whatever, and you really want to just make sure that you're in the hunt in as many categories as possible. If we're talking about, 5x5 roto, of course. As you get into June, you start to get more of an idea of where you're standing. It's not that you can't still make up a lot of ground. Like I've been very rarely, but there have been teams I've had in July that are in last place that I've won with. So, many of us have heard the story about, Rob Silver was in dead last place in the main event. I don't know, a couple months in. Do you remember, Justin?
In July.
Yeah. So, even if you're at the All-Star break, you can still have a monster second half of the season and come back. The biggest thing is you have to keep grinding. You have to keep trying. You cannot give up. You cannot take weeks off. You have to put in the effort. I have, spreadsheets. I have, my teams in documents, and I'm always keeping track of, okay, who's available, who can help me. I'm looking at pitching and hitting schedules, not only for the current week, but for the preceding week as well. Because when the week changes over, so like in Fantrax, for example, and I know we're talking about NFBC here, but also in Fantrax, what you can do is once the week starts, so once the player has played their game for that current week, you can then drop them. So as long as their game has started for the current week, you get their production for that whole week. You can drop them, still get their production for that week, but you're just like, if they're a guy you're streaming for that week, you can now pick up a guy that you see that's still available on waivers that you think will be able to help you the following week. So for me, the biggest thing is keeping track of everything. So I'm not really changing my approach. The only change is I'm looking at my where I'm at in categories, and I'm saying, okay, where do I need to make adjustments? And do I need more steals? One thing I did in a Yahoo league was I ended up dropping Lance Lynn because I still think he's going to be good, but I just didn't need to keep waiting on him because I already had so many innings and I was dominating all the pitching categories. I needed another hitter slot. So I needed to use that slot to stream hitters because there's so many good hitters available. We've got guys going to Coors this week. You need to always be looking at ways to gain an edge, and you can't hold on to guys. You got to get rid of the mental block of, okay, I can't drop this guy because he's Lance Lynn, or I can't drop this guy because of that. You have to do what's best for your team, even if it means making some tough decisions. I've cut good players because they just didn't give me anything that I needed on my team. And you don't want to be too short-sighted, though. You don't want to drop someone who could potentially help you down the line, but at the same time, you need to focus on the now. We're getting to that point in the season now where you can't just keep waiting and waiting and waiting to make your move. You have to start making your move now.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think this is something that is applicable to like every league, in every format. Do not, especially if you were kind of down in a category or down in the standings, like this is not the time to get lackadaisical. It's not the time to kind of like, oh, I don't need to pay attention to this team. I learned this mistake in my first ever NFBC league. It was draft champions. I'd never played NFBC before. And in like June or July, I looked at my team and I was, man, this team sucks. And it was my only team on NFBC. And I went, I'm, maybe I'll set my lineups and stuff, but I'm not really going to, pay attention, like really, really closely. And then I remember checking back in August, and my team had actually gained in the standings. I went from, I think I was in like 12th or 13th, and all of a sudden I was in like 8th. And I was like, whoa, that's weird. Like just setting my lineup every week, like moved me up the standings. And so I really dug into the standings and I went, okay, where can I gain the most points? Where can I, and I ended up fighting my way up into third place and getting my money back. And had I actually paid attention, I probably would have finished second, and I might have even won the league. And it was a real eye-opening experience because I don't care how good the competition is, other people will give up. Now, they may not give up to the same extent in, lesser style leagues in Yahoo and ESPN and Fantrax. Like, you're probably going to have more people give up. Yeah. But you know what? There are people who, like, look at the main event standings right now. There are people who have clearly given up at the bottom of the main event overall. So, like just working your ass off right now, I think is huge. And now is the time to start trying to make up the deficiencies that you have, so that way you're not completely buried, and we'll talk about, this a little bit more here with the next couple segments. But like in my main event league, I have a really good team with really awful pitching ratios, or really awful starting pitching. And I've had to like work my way back up to like start to get my ratios down. But it's because I'm staying really active on the waiver wire and making good decisions in terms of my streaming and my pickups. But like, if I want to be competitive, I got to keep working at that because otherwise I'm just going to fall short of the money. But now's the time. Like, do not get complacent right now because I think other people will, especially as football starts to heat up. Football talk is going to take over the airwaves and going to take over a lot of sites analysis. Now's the time to make sure that you're in tune with things. When do you start caring about the overall in NFBC? So obviously, if you play in Yahoo, if you play in ESPN, Fantrax, there aren't overalls like there are in NFBC. But the big goal for a lot of us in these events is, obviously we want to win our leagues. We want to make sure we're making money. But where you make the most return is by placing the overall and potentially winning an overall. But at some point, you got to make a decision to just cut bait on the overall. At what point do you do that?
Yeah. I mean, you only need to, quote, cut bait on going for the overall if there's a definitive path to winning your league that changes the composition of your team. Like, if you're so far back in saves in the overall that even if you started 3 closers for the rest of the way, you'd only gain like, a few points. That's a situation where obviously, and like, let's say in your league, you can gain more by getting more wins and Ks. Because that's really the only kind of situation where, or similarly with steals, if you're playing a Miles Straw type guy to get steals, and you can gain more points in your league standings by playing another power hitter to gain in runs, RBI, and homers over those steals. But we're nowhere near that point right now. That's way down the line. I mean, I would say like mid-August, maybe you start.
I think that might be too late for some scenarios, but
it depends. It could be. It depends on how dramatic your league compared to the overall is. If you're playing in the overall, though, if you're playing in the main event, you're playing for the overall. Like, in no way should you be early on looking to skip out on the overall and just go for the league win. Like, if you want a high ROI, elite, winning your main event league isn't it. You're in that for the main event to win the overall prize. I get that sometimes shit happens and you're no longer able for that to happen, but you don't want to change course too quickly either. I definitely wouldn't be doing it until after the All-Star break.
Yeah, I think the All-Star break is probably where you start really thinking about it. Like I talked about, I was just talking about my main event team, and I think it's a really good example. This is a team where like I have to rehab my ratios if I want a shot at the overall, and if I want a shot at winning the league, because I think the top two teams in my league.
Well, that's not just one category; that's two. If you're talking about your ratio,
and that's where it becomes the issue. So like if you're deficient in your ratios, then you're deficient in two. If you're deficient in wins and strikeouts, you're deficient in two. If you're deficient in power, you're probably deficient in two, maybe even three. So that's when you have to start making really tough decisions. But again, I think you need to get through June before you start making those decisions.
Oh, easily through June. I'd say probably through July too.
Yeah. So like for me, like, I mean, a week ago, I had a 5 ERA and a 140 whip. And I was in third or fourth place in my main. So like the rest of my team is pretty darn good, except for I'm in last place in ERA and whip. And so I made the decision like, hey, I'm gonna really push to try to get my ERA whip back to respectable levels. So that way I can, potentially make a late season push to try to put my ERA and whip in the middle of the pack. And if I do that, then maybe I can win my league and, try to compete, in the overall. But if I'm not by the end of June, if I still got close to a 5 ERA, 140 whip, then I'm probably going to make a decision to just punt those two categories and see what I can do to try to recoup some of my money. But again, I'm waiting.
What are you gonna do? Like, are you gonna? Do you have a significant amount to gain in like wins and Ks or what?
I got enough where I can gain. Like, I wouldn't say significant necessarily. And I can bring up my standings.
I don't know. Like, even the end of June feels super early to me to give up on that. Like, you can still move the needle quite a bit.
Yes, you can.
From July to the end of the season.
And I think one of the things too is unlike home runs or stolen bases or even saves, ratios are the only category where other people can move back to you.
Sure.
And so, like, I think oftentimes we get to like downtrodden on like, oh, my ERA and RIP suck, or my batting average sucks, but the other people can come back to you, and those things move. Tonto has done some great work about end of the season ratio movement. And the ratio categories move a lot more than other categories. But for instance, like right now, I'm 5th place in strikeouts, with easily being able to catch the 3 of the 4 people in front of me.
Okay, so if you're already within range of that, I wouldn't say that you need to shift to try to move to, like, you wouldn't even need a full month to make that move. You know what I mean? Like, you probably need like 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So why would you even be thinking about making a move in June or July?
It just depends on where I'm at. Like, if I'm,
it does.
Like currently, like right now, like I said, like I've rehabbed my ERA and whip, a fair amount over the last 2 weeks. I've gone from a 5 year, I think I had a 5.1 ERA 2 weeks ago, and I'm down to a 4.7. I had a 4.5 ERA, or maybe even a 1.4 whip, or maybe a 1.5 whip. And it's down to 1.37, and now I'm in striking distance of other people, and so
Yeah,
I don't think I'm going to be in that position, but I definitely want to keep my options open. If that comes out to it, but like you said, this is probably an after All-Star break kind of move.
yes, I would say so for sure. And this is just at this point in the season, this is when you need to be vigilant when it comes to your categories. Because I'm the first month and a half or so, I'm not super vigilant about, like, I'm trying to play my best player. I'm trying to make sure that the best players are on my team. We have a much better idea of who players are 2 months into the season than we do after the first month. Because, now, I'm much less apt to believe in a Jose Abreu breakout at this point. After 1 month, I wasn't convinced. After 2 months, now I'm thinking, okay, I'm not seeing a light at the end of this tunnel. So I'm trying to put the best players on my team in the first 2 months. And then after that, I'm going to start focusing on attacking the categories and playing guys strategically. So, if like one move I made that's going to be, maybe kind of questionable, but Tim Anderson right now in a league where I don't need average, and he's not running because he doesn't trust his knee yet, and he's not hitting for power either. He's hitting for average, but he's in a shitty offense that's not getting him runs or RBI. I actually benched him in the league because I desperately need steals. Ironically, he's not giving me steals. I played Will Benson over him because Will Benson, I think, is a much better chance to give me some steals in this week. So, like, it's little moves like that I'm looking at every player on my roster, and I'm looking at their schedule, and I'm saying, what are they going to give me this week, and where am I going to be deficient, and where can I move the needle the most? So, but you just want to keep staying well-rounded, because even if you really need steals, you don't just want to put a bunch of like Miles Straw guys on there. You don't want to give away points in RBI and homers and stuff just because you need steals. You just want to keep getting guys who can give you steals here and there. Leody Taveras, stuff like that. Get guys who can, Ezekiel Duran, guys who can steal here and there, and it'll add up over time, because you just need to gain a little bit each week.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important. I think this is a good, a good point. If you haven't already, you should have been hopefully already earlier on in the season, but really spreadsheet things out, like you mentioned.
Yes.
Like, really see, like, hey, where are these jumps that I can make? Like, and start being really smart about your allocation of resources in Fab, and about your, making sure you're optimizing your lineup every beginning of every week and then at the end of every week. Don't just like, hey, oh, my guy's still healthy, he's going back in. No, really play the matchups, really figure out where you can, gain those points and try to game the system a little bit. Let's talk a little bit. I mean, I put punting categories. I think that really falls into like what we were just talking about in terms of the overall. You don't want to punt categories like until you absolutely know that there's no rationale to trying to compete in a category. You don't want to punt.
Yeah, don't punt until you absolutely have to when it comes to an overall competition. In individual leagues, you can think about punting if it makes sense. Like, if you can only potentially move up, and we're talking within the last 2 months of the season here, by the way, not now.
Yeah.
We're talking like August. If you can only move up 3 points in saves, or you can, stop with the saves, you can maybe lose a point in saves, but you can move up 6 points in Ks and wins, then yeah, that's a move you want to make at that point. But yeah, especially in an overall, you're not giving up anytime soon on anything.
Yeah. How do you determine who to hold on to and who to drop? And when I'm talking about guys, like, I'm not talking about like the guys you took in like, the back half of your draft. Like, those guys obviously are interchangeable. You should, if you've had guys you took after round 15, like they're struggling at this point, like they should have already been dropped.
Yeah.
But we're talking about like the Jose Abreu's. We're talking about the Tim Andersons. We're talking like the Alek Manoah. Like, I think you probably already should have dropped Alek Manoah, but I have him on the bench of some of my teams. At what point should you be like making decisions on some of these studs or guys we thought were studs that are clearly not?
Yeah, I mean, so you have to look at the underlying stats, right? Like it's not just about what have they done, but it's about, look at the luck factors, look at, if you're talking about hitters, you're looking at their, hard contact, you're looking at their launch angle, you're looking at their max EV, their contact rate. Compare it to previous years. Look and see what's going wrong here. Their strikeout rate. I mentioned Jose Abreu as an example. He was a guy who I recently dropped in a Yahoo league. I did not drop him. I dropped him in a Fantrax league. I did not drop him in. I own him in a NFBC league too. I don't remember if it was Glarf or my super. Maybe it's my super. So pretty much my highest entry fee league, I still have him in. The thing is, he's still hitting in the middle of the Houston lineup. In 12s, I definitely think he's a drop. In 15s, it's still kind of close because he still can be productive. It depends on whether I can replace him with someone else or I'm okay at first base. But I think he is potentially droppable. I mean, Tim Anderson's not droppable. He should be fine once he eventually gains the confidence back in his knee. I think that'll happen sooner than later. He's still hitting for good average. He's still helping you in some ways. It's frustrating waiting on the steals to come back. But it's really an individual thing. It depends on the guy. It depends on how much you believe in the player. So like Taylor Ward was a guy I really believed in coming into the year. I was not willing to give up on him. And honestly, I was just waiting for signs of life to then re-pick up all the shares that I had dropped in Fantrax or that other people had dropped. And now that we're seeing him start to come alive again, it's a good thing that, I never considered dropping him in any NFBC league, but thank God, because he's now starting to go off. So it depends, like you said, you're not talking about the guys you drafted at the end. So you're probably talking about the guys that you believed in coming into the year. You got to look for signs of life. That's really what it's about. All right. Do you see anything like look at their 40 game rolling averages? Do you see them making gains in any way? You got to know what the issues are and then figure it out from there. So for everybody, it's different though.
Yeah. So I think for me, the answer is twofold. It's one, is there something that, like you said, like there is some sort of skill that tells me that they're going to turn things around, right? Like, or do I have a real belief that they're going to turn things around? Like, Tim Anderson is a really good example of someone who I go, yeah, like I know things don't look good. The underlying skills aren't necessarily great, but I think it is a little bit of kind of an injury hangover. I think he's going to be fine. He's at least, we know he's going to steal bases. I think, at some point he's going to hit high up in the lineup. Like there's a lot there that there's still enough to like where I go, okay, maybe I'm not starting him every week right now, but he needs to be on my roster. And the other part of it, and sometimes the more important part of it, is who am I replacing him with? Like they're like rage dropping someone just to get them off your team doesn't do much unless you're picking up someone that you think can outdo their value. Mm-hmm. So like I think that it's and one of the issues I've had with not wanting to drop Alek Manoah is I go, oh, like who am I really picking up in some of these 15 team leagues?
K-Ron.
Yeah, at the end of the day, just about anybody. Like, I mean, last start was, a third of an inning, giving up, I think, 7 or 8 runs. So, but I think it's really important to like, hey, if you're going to drop a Jose Abreu, how many like first basemen are available that's going to hit in the middle of a really good lineup? Like, there's not a lot of guys out there like that. Like, who are you replacing them with? So I think that's a really good question to ask yourself. Like, hey, is the guy I'm dropping him for, does he have a reasonable outcome that outproduces the guy I'm dropping?
Like, if you're in a league where you can drop him and pick up like a Christian Encarnacion Strand, who's probably going to be up soon and who I expect to be good. And granted, he's a prospect. He might not be good. Mm-hmm. I would take him over Abreu right now. But like, in NFBC, that's probably like a $200+ bid. So
yeah,
it's like you said, the guys that you're going to be replacing him with probably aren't going to be on his level. Like, Ryan Noda is a guy who you might be able to get in the league right now, but like he only plays versus righties. He's got like a 34% K rate. He's got all these warts, and it's like, I think he's on a hot streak right now. I think he's worth playing for this week. But beyond that, would I rather have that than Jose Abreu? No. So it's like you said, all depends on who you're picking up to replace him with.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, moving right along. When you're holding on to injured players, and I think this one is really applicable to every league. Now, I know a lot of leagues, most leagues that aren't NFBC have IL spots, right? If your guy gets hurt, you can throw him on the IL.
Yahoo does, I know.
Yeah, ESPN does too. CBS does. Most leagues have IL spots. That being said, in a lot of those leagues, those IL spots are filled with studs. It's been, you've got Max Fried, or
Woodruff,
Woodruff, I think this is applicable to everything because there are people who are holding IL guys on their actual bench, even if they have IL spots in the league. But at what point do you start having to make cuts? Like, how do you determine the guys? Because we're now 2 months into the season. It's a 6-month season, which means there's only 4 months left. A guy's out 8 weeks. He's missing half of the remaining season.
Right.
How do you make the determination on who to keep, who to cut?
I mean, there's a couple of factors. It's, obviously, like, it's really an individual situation that you have to evaluate individually. Like, what's the injury? Is it an arm injury or shoulder injury for a pitcher? Is it a hitter who, has a finger injury, like a wrist injury? Every injury is different, and knowing how those injuries affect players coming back helps a lot. This is why I spend as much time as I do researching injuries and stuff, because I want to know what I'm going to be getting when they come back, because so many people think that when someone's activated, it's like, oh, I got him back, he's good to go now. It's rarely the case. I almost never start a pitcher coming off of an injury, especially if it's a long layoff. I mean, like the Tristan McKenzie returning to dominate off of being out for 2 months is few and far between. Usually they don't look good. They're limited in pitches. They get hit up in the first start or two. It's just never a good idea. It's rarely a good idea. It depends on how good the player is. We talked about the difference between holding on to a guy like Eduardo Rodriguez and holding on to, a Max Fried or a Brandon Woodruff. So am I getting an ace back, or am I getting a guy who's a solid pitcher but nothing special? Or, Riley Green missing 6 to 8 weeks. How long is even worth holding on to a guy like Riley Green? Like, I like his talent, but he's not great. He's in a bad park and a bad offense. What can you really expect from him? So there's all these questions. It's how good is the player? How serious is the injury? Is that injury going to affect their performance when they return? Is there a risk of me taking zeros? Like, if I hold this guy, what does the rest of my roster look like? What does my bench look like? Can I put the other guys on my bench in? There's some teams that I play against in Fantrax. There's one guy who has like every prospect on his team, and it fills his entire bench, and he's even taking some zeros in his starting lineup because he doesn't want to drop prospects. And it's like, dude, you are, you're missing the big picture here. I don't remember what the quote is, but missing the trees for the forest, or forest for the trees, or whatever it is. Like, you're taking zeros because you're so excited that these guys are going to be great when they come up and all this other stuff. You cannot do that. Like, you can get free points by playing guys who are actually playing. You don't want to give up current production for potential future production. Like, you have to have balance between the two. And so I don't want to hold too many injured guys and prospects coming up and stuff like that on my bench when I need players to play right now. And I don't, because then that leads to making bad decisions within your lineup. That leads to playing Seattle hitters when they have 2 games versus other teams who are playing guys with 4 games for that half week. Same thing with pitchers. That leads to having to start a guy against the Texas Rangers offense instead of being able to pick up a streamer to play versus the A's like you did. These are the things that you need to be able to, win win really any league. You need to be able to make these decisions and keep that balance. because it's really like there's no catch-all wisdom that I can give you that's going to apply to every situation. I look at every situation individually, but don't just hold a guy to hold a guy, and don't drop him just to drop him. You got to know what the situation is.
And this is one of the reasons why, like, we'll start every week with a news episode, because we're going to talk about each individual situation and try to give our best advice. You know, I definitely want. I mean, I agree with everything you said. Like, I don't, but I also don't want to say no notes. There's a guy in my auction league, and this is an auction league where I am in first place, and I've been battling back and forth with Matt Davis of FTN, who's a good buddy of ours.
Yep, good buddy, good friend, a good player too.
And we sat next to each other in this auction in Vegas. It was a blast. The guy who had been in third for most of April was holding on to every injured pitcher and picking guys up. Like, he picked up Liam Hendricks early on, to the point where he was taking 1 to 2 zeros each week in pitching just in order to hold on to all these guys. Now, almost all these guys are back. Tyler Glasnow's back. Justin Verlander's back. Liam Hendricks is now back. But he's over 100 strikeouts behind me. You know, he is 10 wins behind me. And he still hasn't gotten Brandon Woodruff back. Now, he could make a huge run, and maybe it'll be worth it. My guess is he never catches me in those categories. And like I just think it's a huge mistake to not just to take zeros. Obviously, taking zeros is a huge mistake. But put yourself in a position to
where
take
you could.
Zeros. Yeah. Because like what happened to me in my main event last week was like I entered the week healthy and I had 3 outfielders go down. So I had to take a zero. Even though I had 2 replacements, the third one couldn't replace. Now, if I had been keeping a bunch of injured guys on my roster and that had happened, I might have had to take 3 zeros. That would have been devastating for them.
Yep.
And so like, do not put yourself in a position to take those zeros, and definitely don't purposely take zeros. Like I just think that is just a huge mistake that I see people make. And this guy's like, you know, like a legitimately decent player. Like I've played with him in other leagues that he's won. Like I don't understand what he was doing. I'm going to ask him.
Are we not saying his name or what?
Mark Northern. Like he was Northern.
I don't know the name.
He was leading the Aux Championship in a different league earlier on this season. And so I'm going to ask him when I see him in Vegas, like, what were you doing there? Because I think it put him in a hole that I don't know that he's going to be able to catch up from.
Right.
So maybe if he listens, hey, hit me up. Hit me up and let me know.
I was just curious. Like that's you see that. I mean, I see that kind of thing more often in like some of my fan tracks leagues and maybe I don't normally see that in NFBC. But
I don't either. Once a year, I have someone in a league that does something like that.
Yeah, I was gonna say you do see it. You just don't see a lot of it. Like it's usually one person in the league at most,
and it's usually their first year playing in NFBC. I think my main event 2 years ago, a guy drafted every single starting pitcher that was supposed to come back midseason from Tommy John. Oh. And I looked at the end of his draft and I went, I don't think he has 9 pitchers that he can play. And he didn't. And he ended up having to take zeros, until he finally made the decision to drop guys in order to field a full active lineup. And by that point, like he was done. Like he
and so another point along what you just said with the returning from Tommy John. So like these guys returning from Tommy John, even when they come back, you're not going to want them. Like they're not going to be themselves. They're going to be a much reduced version of themselves. They're going to have bad control. Like you don't want them the year that they come back. You want them the next year. This is the biggest mistake I see people make with injuries. They don't understand that the player that when they return often isn't the player that they were like when they were healthy before. And another thing I think that people don't think about, especially with pitching, is when they come back, you almost have to think of it as an extra week because most times you're not going to want to start a pitcher when they come back. You're going to want to wait another week. And then what if they look really bad? Then you might want to wait another week after that. So like what looks like a 6 to 8 week injury maybe is more like an 8 to 10 week injury because That's the actual realistic timeline of when you're going to be putting them in your rotation.
And that's if they don't have a setback. We thought Glasnow was going to be back earlier, and he ended up having a setback. He's now back, but that was an extra 2 weeks.
Right.
And then were you going to start him the first week against the Dodgers? I didn't start him in the one league I had him in.
Even if it's a start against a bad team, often I don't ever want to start a pitcher coming off a long layoff, because like I said, the McKenzie return happens 1 out of like 50 times, if that. It's super rare. It just never happens.
I would much rather be wrong because I didn't start a guy than be wrong because I did.
Exactly. Yep.
So, and I mean, if we move away from like fab leagues too, like this is mistake gets made all the time in draft champions leagues, and that is filling up your roster with a bunch of guys who are starting the year on the IL because they'll be back at some point. Because you see those 50 lineup or 50 roster spots, and you go, well, I'll make do until they get back. Right. You may not be in the picture by the time they get back, or you may have a ton more injuries. If the last few years have taught us anything, is players are going to get hurt constantly, and you are not going to be able to survive. Again, and this is also loading up on prospects, which is something you mentioned about that guy in your Fantrax league. Like, loading up on a ton of prospects or injured players in these leagues is the recipe for disaster. You look at guys who are really, really good at draft champions leagues or draft and old leagues, Rob DiPietro, Steven Weimer. They have really safe, boring teams that just crush everybody in plate appearances and innings.
Exactly. Yep. The more boring, the better, honestly. Oh God, what was I going to say? Okay. So one thing was before, when I first met Zach, I think it was like, I don't know if it was 3 years ago now. Maybe. I think it was maybe like, I think it might've been 3 years ago, like going into the 2020 season, I think. When I first started talking to him, he was that guy. He was the guy who would draft every prospect. He was I straight up told him, I'm like, your teams are horrendous. Like, this, you can't sustain playing like this. You can't take all these risks. You can take like maybe one of these guys to make it work. And like, he is completely changed. Like, he's become exponentially better since I first met him. He's a really good player now. But he had to make that switch in his brain where he was like, oh, that's hurting me. I need to stop doing that and make this wholesale change. And he did. And it was a quick change, and now he's a really, really good player. And then
it's a mistake I made in my first main event league. I didn't have very much experience,
right?
You know, in NFBC
period,
And I went, hey, like, the way to win this overall is to like load up on high variance talent and hope they all hit. And guess what? Even though some of them did hit, too many of them didn't. And there was no way of coming back, especially because I loaded up with a bunch of guys who were coming back injured. I had no flexibility in my roster. Other guys got injured, and all of a sudden I was screwed.
Also, if you're talking about early DCs, like if you're drafting in like January, February, like or God forbid, like December,
or October.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Yeah. Anything February or earlier, like if you're going to load up on all these injured guys, and then on top of that, you're probably going to be adding 20% more injured players from spring training and the off season. Like you're assuming that everybody you're drafting that's healthy when you draft them is going to be healthy at the beginning of the year. That's rarely the case.
Yeah.
So like, that's another thing. Like you draft all these injured players who you know are going to be out until June, July, August, whatever. But hey, you've got 50 spots, blah, blah, blah. No, like you can't do that shit. You can take one or two here or there, but you can't load up on that. I mean, it doesn't work.
Yeah. And I mean, like, as much as the meme is to talk about my 2019 main event team where I made all those mistakes, I'm very injury averse now. Like, I'm very risk averse.
It taught you a lesson that now made you a better player. Yeah.
And my DC teams are murdered with injuries. Like, I've got and like I said, like I will stash no more than 5 players. That means a total of 5 prospects or players that are currently injured. And my teams are murdered murdered with right now with injuries. And, you know, in spite of that, you know, some of them are doing, you know, most of them are doing fairly well. But at the same time, like it's left me in a really big predicament. And had I been more, you know, risky, like there's no way I'd be surviving right now.
Yeah, 100%.
All right. I think that was a really good episode. Hopefully people enjoyed it. If you have thoughts or ideas for future strategy sections or you know different sections for this podcast, please let us know via Twitter. You can reach Dave on Twitter at RunDMCD. Don't forget the D. You can reach me on Twitter at Justin Mason FWFB. Friends Fantasy Benefits on Twitter at Fantasy Benefits. Dave, what do you got going on in your world?
Yeah. Well, if you've listened to any of our prior episodes, you already know this. But as I said, I have some pitching and hitting schedules on Rotosaurus, where I will have the hitting schedules up shortly after Jake puts them up. But we've got the pitching schedules up. It's for the current week and then the following week, and it allows you to look ahead and see, okay, who's got good matchups coming up. And I keep it updated as often as I can. It'll definitely be updated by like Sunday night. I try to have it done before Fab, but I try to keep you know, if you do it like day to day ish, you know, then I don't have to do it all at once. So but yeah, then the pitcher schedules I translate into the hitter schedules too, so you can see what potential pitchers your hitters are going to be facing in the upcoming week. So it allows you to start thinking about who you want to pick up in NFBC, or if you're in Yahoo Fantrax, kind of a look ahead to see who you can pick up, you know, even right now when you're listening to the episode. So, you know, like I've already picked up Jake Fraley for the following week because since he gets, I think, 5 or 6 righties next week as well. So, you know, you should always be looking ahead and get the jump on the rest of your league and pick up your guys while it's still early in the current week, because you already know, you know, who you can drop from your team and for a lot of these guys. So make sure you're getting the guys that you need on your team as soon as you can, so you don't miss out on anyone.
And you can read all my stuff over on Fangraphs, where we're in daily, or on Fantasy Pros, where we're in 3 days a week. Email me or the show, friendsoffantasybenefits@gmail.com. And catch me on the Sleeper on the Bus podcast, as well as, of course, the Friends of Fantasy Benefits podcast. For Dave and myself, thank you for listening. Have a fantastic baseball season.